Namaskar to all of you. This is a series that we are doing on the book Synthesis of Yoga, written by Sri Aurobindo. One common thing to all of us gathered here maybe is that all of us have a yearning or a curiosity or a wish to understand what yoga is and practice yoga. And here, in terms of integral yoga, it is not just about a communion with the divine in an eternal, timeless space. It is a gradual expression of the divine potential within us and a transformation of our whole nature in here and now. So it is not a one moment thing, it's a journey. Yoga is a journey, a slow and a gradual process for most of us. And just like we go on any journey, it is important for us to know what all to carry with us, what are our tools, what are our aids, what are the helps on the way. Say for example, we go to a hilltop, we do a trek. So we all need to know what all stuff that we need to carry on the way. And since it's a journey upwards, so it's important that we travel light. And in traveling light, one has to prioritize those things which are the most important for us. Those are the things which we carry with us. So in the inner journey towards the divine, also one has to prioritize and see what are those most important things that one needs to carry, one needs to have a sight on the way towards the divine. And this is what Sri Aurobindo describes through this chapter, which is called as the 4 aids or the 4 helps on the way of yoga and journey. Those 4 aids are: number 1, Shastra; number 2, Utsaaha or our personal effort; number 3, the Guru or the guide or the teacher; and number 4 is Kala or time. So let's start with the first one, which is the Shastra. And if we reflect on the word Shastra, what does it mean? Does it mean a book which we read and we learn and we recite to others? Or is it a book that we read bit by bit and imbibe in our life and bring it into practice? And what kind of book is it? Is it a spiritual book? Is it a religious book? Is it a self-help book? So here Sri Aurobindo talks about what does Shastra truly mean in terms of integral yoga, and he says, the supreme Shastra of the integral yoga is the eternal Veda secret in the heart of every thinking and living being. So the supreme Shastra is actually not outside, it is the eternal Veda secret which is present in the heart of all of us, everywhere. The lotus of the eternal knowledge and the eternal perfection. So he calls this Shastra as a lotus of eternal knowledge, where there is all-knowing and eternal perfection, is a bud closed and folded in all of us. So it is a lotus, but it is folded like a bud in all of us, and it opens petal by petal. And it opens petal by petal through every experience of our life. every pain, every challenge, every difficult moment in our life has a certain learning or a certain possibility of opening or unfolding of this lotus. If in those challenging moments we feel like a victim or we feel the pain and we turn away from the learning, then the process of opening is delayed. But if we take up the attitude of gratitude and trust and see it as an opportunity for learning in life, and we face the situation, then that Supreme Shastra opens up more and more towards being a lotus. And very often, every experience of that kind and every learning that we are having through a book in our outer world is actually a mirroring of the same Supreme Shastra which is located within us. So it mirrors outside. Because all kinds of wisdom is present within us also and outside in this world also. There is so much that has been written on spirituality, life. It's enormous literature is available. We here are also speaking. Every Sunday there is a new speaker, somebody is speaking. We speak for 40 minutes, half an hour. But it is what is the priority for us or what really resonates with us is what we carry every time. And that is what is the mirroring of the Supreme Shastra from within outside. It's a very interesting experiment. I'm sure many of us would have done it, is to sit peacefully with any of the spiritual books. People used to do it with Ramcharitramanas or with Bhagavad Gita, or some of us with Synthesis of Yoga or Savitri, is to sit peacefully with a question in mind, a clear intent and focus and aspiration, and then randomly open up a page in the book. And funnily, many a times, the answer that we are seeking is in front of us. So this is the meaning of that mirroring that happens every time from our inner Shastra to the outer Shastra. And hence Sri Aurobindo also says that nothing can actually be taught to a mind which is not already folded in or is present as a potential within the soul. So any kind of education is actually a revealing. Nothing can be taught to anyone. But then what about all these Shastras or the great books that have been written? Are they to be completely rejected? The great books, Upanishads, Vedas, the Bhagavad Gitas. And if we look at these books, they are generally of two kinds. One which talk about the philosophy of life, of spirituality, a seeking of the truth, the meaning of the divine. And a second group which generally are talking about the methods or techniques of yoga. For example, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is largely focused on the subject of what are the various techniques and practices of yoga. But if we look at both of them, they largely represent the experience of the past yogins. So, the experience of the past yogins is actually very beautiful, and we can draw inspiration. And as we just discussed, we can mirror our own unfolding through those Shastras. But key here is not to limit ourselves by any spoken word. Because anything that comes in the realm of word has its own limitations. And here Sri Aurobindo reminds us and gives us a choice, tells us that do we want to be those pilgrims who have a set road or a highway towards a well-charted out destination? So many of these books offer very good path, a very well delineated path on which one can travel with signposts and the key things to practice at different stages. So are we to be those pilgrims on that highway to the one common destination? Or the other choice is to be the pathfinders in the virgin forest. Find one's own unique path. Since integral yoga is not just about communion with the divine, it is also about coming back and expressing fully to the best possible capacity the potential within. And we all understand that the potential within all of us is unique. So how can we limit ourselves based on a Shastra which represents the unique potential of somebody else? So it is about finding our own unique path in yoga and finding one's own unique Shastra, the supreme Shastra within our hearts in yoga. To quote Swami Vivekananda, he once said that the true unity of religion will happen only when everybody has their own unique religion. So he talks about unity and uniqueness at the same time, because if we do not have our own unique religion, if we all are following a certain sect or a group, then there is eventually bound to be differences of opinion. But if there is an understanding and if we acknowledge that there cannot be a sect, there has to be a unique path for every yogin, then only there can be a true unity amongst all of us. The similar truth was expressed by Mahatma Gandhi also, who once said that truth is like branches of a tree. It finds a different expression in all of us. So this is what the Supreme Shastra is. It is folded within all of us as a bud, and we need to find our own unique path. And one may draw inspiration from the Shastras written in the past, but one doesn't have to get limited by them. So once we become aware that there is this eternal Veda within all of us, it also takes a sincere student in order to find it and be close to it and learn from it. And that brings us to the second aid amongst the four, that is Utsaaha, or personal effort. But where does one put one's personal effort in the path of yoga? How and where is the question. To understand this, one can imagine a human system having two centers. One is more superficial, which is attracted and absorbed in what is going on outside. It is seeking human love, it is seeking human validation. It is contracted and trying to possess things. And then there is a deeper center within all of us, which feels a deeper and a deeper love. A love which is more and more self-giving, which doesn't want anything in return. And that's something we can all connect to. When we love somebody deeply, we feel an urge of more and more giving without wanting anything in return. And what that brings is a certain sense of joy. It connects us to a sense of abundance, a joy, infinite joy of the spirit. And it brings with it a certain sense of oneness with this whole universe. And we don't feel separate in the narrow mold of ego. So we have these two centers, and yoga is a practice of turning with intensity to this inner center more and more. And the key word here is intensity, because the world outside is also seeking us with a lot of intensity. We have our work, we have our insecurities, we have our desires, there is entertainment, there are advertisements. There's so many things which are intensely seeking our attention. And it is not just outside. Even when we choose to turn inwards, we are faced with a lot of restlessness. It's like a cyclone of restlessness that we witness inside. Very often we all get to hear that I just cannot meditate. The moment I close my eyes, I become even more restless. And this is what we get to see, that there is an intense seeking from outside as well, and then there is a storm inside. So it takes a lot of intensity, a lot of personal effort on our own part in order to break this narrow mold and go deeper within into this center of abundance and oneness. And in what forms will that intensity express itself? A beautiful example in the history of India and mankind is Mirabai, who was completely absorbed in the love of Krishna. For her, that represented that oneness and abundance, and she was completely absorbed. Her high heart cried out without wanting anything else. She just wanted Krishna. It is one thing for all of us to seek the divine in the sense and trying to intellectually understand what really is God. We all have curiosities, or in order to deal with our insecurities and fears, we go out seeking for the divine, or we have desires that if we have the divine, then I can do this, I can do that. But in the true intense aspiration, when one actually seeks the divine for the sake of the divine and doesn't want anything else, is when the divine truly responds back to us. And it is beautifully expressed in the bhajan, कौन कहते हैं कि भगवान आते नहीं, तुम मीरा के जैसे बुलाते नहीं. So it is a vyakulta, an intense aspiration in the heart. But it is not just about an aspiration in the heart, because one can have these fleeting experiences. But if our mind is scattered, then soon the experience gets lost. So it is very important to gather the scattered mind and develop a concentration in the mind, because concentration is that one thing through which we can pierce through and get to the depths of any subject, whether it's outside or inside. And in this case, through concentration, we can pierce through the cyclone of restlessness within and find that deeper space of abundance within all of us. And thirdly, it also calls for determination, perseverance, and a force of will, because again, it's a journey. There will be ups and downs, and one has to go on again and again, day in, day out, So perseverance is required, motivation is required. And to think of it, what really would motivate us on this path? If we look at our daily life, our motivation to do things generally is that if I do this, I will get this in return. There is a certain goal, or there is something that we are seeking out of our actions. But here we are talking about an inner seeking. So what really can be the motivation for a person to day in, day out, seek the divine every day? And to understand this, in the 20th century, there was a beautiful experiment that was conducted where the concept of extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation was studied. They took two groups of children, students, and they were put in a room where there was a glass through which one could look outside, but the children couldn't see that somebody was seeing them. And both the groups were taught a certain maths question to solve, a process they were both taught. And after that, they were given a question paper of 10 questions. One group was told that if you finish this paper, then you would get something in reward, something to eat, something sweet. And the other group was just let alone to solve the question paper for the joy of solving it. And what they found was that in the group where some reward was offered, till the time the teacher or the invigilator was inside, the kids were motivated to do the question paper, but the moment the invigilator left, the kids would engage in something else. But more often in the other group where the children were doing the process for the sake of the process or the joy of the process, they were more often engaging in the process. They were solving the questions. So by that and many such experiments, certain basic conclusions were drawn about intrinsic motivation, that it can be much more powerful than any form of extrinsic motivation. And the intrinsic motivation basically is when one doesn't really is looking for anything outside, but one is just doing something for the joy of doing it, and one feels more free in the process. Anything that makes us more free or liberated in life just intrinsically motivates us. And thirdly, anything which expands our capacities also motivates us much more than any extrinsic motivation. So one may draw inspiration again from this experiment in our determination of personal effort. We go inwards because there is a place inwards where we can feel more free and liberated, where there is an expansion of our capacities, and we seek the divine just for the sake of the divine and just for the sake of the process of seeking, because it brings in such joy. And what happens is that when the outer center is trying to contact this inner center with this zeal, with this intent and aspiration, the inner center feeds this personal effort. It feeds through its abundance, and it sort of grows through that process. And gradually this intense personal effort goes on and becomes effortless. One can experience this in meditation also, that when we start meditating, there are all kinds of things that are going through our mind, and it takes strong, intense effort in the beginning of the meditation. But as gradually the mind settles down, the process becomes more and more effortless. So this is in a short span of time and space, but on the long journey of practice of integral yoga also, gradually the process becomes more and more effortless. And here Sri Aurobindo says that so long there is not some measure of sustained identity and a personal contact, so until there is not a sustained identity with this inner center and a sustained contact with this inner center, our personal effort needs to predominate. But to the proportion that one gets more and more identified and stays more and more in touch with this inner center, the ego has to more and more acknowledge that behind its own personal effort there is a Shakti, or there is that abundance feeding us, and it needs to more and more submit to that Shakti. It is actually this Shakti which starts the process of unfolding of this lotus, and it is a blessing, truly a blessing from that Shakti and Divine Mother, that we are all sitting here. We at least have this seeking or an aspiration to understand this subject, to be close to this subject, and it is actually this Shakti which drives the whole process. So at some point one needs to learn to submit to this Shakti more and more. One can understand this with the example of a spiral, that first, that through our personal effort this outer center goes inwards, and then this inner center feeds our personal effort, and then again more personal effort, and then again more feeding, until it gains momentum, and it starts to gain more and more momentum. It wants to expand, and when it gains a lot of momentum, it wants to expand beyond us. Our own narrow mold of ego, our own personal effort can actually come in the way. It is my sadhana, it is my bhakti. What do I do? Should I do this or should I do that? Actually starts to come in the way of the momentum of the spiral, and that is the time for a sadhak to submit more and more and get out of one's own way and surrender to the divine Shakti. But here again, Sri Aurobindo comes back to warn the sadhak from giving up one's personal effort in the hands of the divine too early and seeing oneself as an instrument. And he talks about 3 possible side effects of giving up too early. First being a calamitous falsity. That is, one may feel that, oh, I'm just going in the flow of the divine, in the spiral of the divine, but actually it is the forces of falsehood or one's own subconscious desires is what is driving us, and we think that we are doing sadhana in the name of the divine. So one has to be careful of a calamitous falsity. The second being a helpless inertia coming over. I am not the doer, divine is the doer, I am the instrument. I have given myself up in the hands of the divine. It may sound very nice, and once we have gained momentum for a degree, it might be good, but gradually a sense of tamas may enter into our system, and one may feel that one is doing yoga, but a lot of inertia and tamas enters us. The third being a magnifying movement of the ego. As the spiral expands and it gains momentum, siddhis start to come in. There is an expansion of the capacity of the human being, and one may start to see oneself as a special instrument of the divine, bigger than others, more important than others. may create mega plans for oneself and for others, but actually in process it is only serving a more magnified form of its own ego, and in a way one turns further away from the divine rather than getting close to the divine. To understand this with a few examples from our daily life and the importance even in surrender to be able to be aware in every moment of the first few thoughts and intentions that we carry in every action and how it decides in which way we are going to spiral. Because this outer center can spiral in with our energies of vital desires, with falsehood, a lot of external things, or it can spiral with that inner center. So our first few thoughts and intentions and an awareness of what all is happening within us is important. To take an example of our eating food and offering the food to the divine. One may think that now I have offered the food to the divine, and no matter what I eat is actually prasad on my plate, and eat whatever they want. But actually many of the times what is at work within us is still the vital desires and attachments to a certain kinds of foods. So it is very important for us to be aware that in that moment the food is not being offered to the divine, it is still being offered to those vital desires and attachments within us largely. So it is important to become aware of this influence, detach from this influence of the desires, let go of attachments to the preference of any kind of food, and then using one's buddhi to recognize whatever would be the best possible food for this individual temple of the divine, and then offering it to the divine, and that is how that offering is more likely to be acceptable to the higher nature. Being a dermatologist, we very often see patients with an itch-scratch cycle. We see them having a sensation of itch on their body, and then they scratch, which leads to a doubling of their itching sensation, and they scratch more. And then the itching sensation goes on expanding and increasing, and they scratch more and more, ultimately reaching a point that they really want to tear their skin apart. And we call it in medical science itch-scratch cycle. And when somebody sees somebody tearing apart their skin, it's very easy to tell him, please don't do that. But for that person, it is almost nearly impossible to stop because the spiral has already gone too far. But what we generally share to the patient is that it's not at the end that you have a choice, but in the first circumstance you have the choice. When you have the first sensation of itch, you have the choice of either dealing with yourself with kindness and compassion, creating a spiral within, and in that process there is a possibility of you healing your own disorder, or engaging in the scratching process with an irritability and ending up worsening the disorder that you're facing in your life. Another simple example is of relationships. One may say, I have offered my relationships to the divine. But there also one needs to be aware of the attachments one has in the relationships, the expectations one has in relationships, the insecurities, the resentments one is carrying. If one offers the relationship to the divine without really becoming aware of them, it doesn't really transform. But if one actually becomes aware of them, accepts them, and finds a way to let go of these attachments and resentments, and then offer the relationship to the divine, then it can be beautifully transformed. Another example, at the level of our mind, one can feel that I have surrendered my mind to the divine. But if the mind is scattered, if the mind is rigid, if the mind is holding on to its own point of view, then a surrender would largely still mean a further expansion in the rigidity of the mind. But if one develops that flexibility and suppleness in the mind, that ability or capacity to look at different points of views and integrate them into one, and an ability to gather the scattered mind into concentration and then offer it to the divine, then the divine transforms this mind and opens it up to a supramental transformation. So these are some key examples and which tell us about the importance of the personal effort not just being a process of aspiration or an intense effort inwards, but also a process of rejection of attachments. So it is a process of aspiration and rejection, and then followed by surrender. And then surrender to whom? It is a surrender to the third aid, which is the inner guide or the divine within. So in today's talk, we will be talking mainly about the first two, the personal effort and the Shastra, but we will briefly go over the other two aids, which is the inner guide and Kala. So the inner guide or the guru word for us many a times represents an individual outside. But here Sri Aurobindo refers to that inner guide within us as the true guru. And that true guru may be mirrored just like the Shastra in individuals outside in one's lifetime, but it is actually the eternal guide within. And he expresses what really that eternal guide means through these few lines. It is immaterial whether the Guru is first seen as an impersonal wisdom or a love and power behind all things, as an absolute manifesting in the relative, so the transcendent being manifesting in time and space and attracting it, or as one's highest self or the highest self of all, as a divine person within us and in the world, which we may know through different names, Krishna, Shiva, the Mother, or as the ideal which the mind conceives, or as an ideal self. In the end, we perceive that He is all and more than all these things put together. The mind's door of entry to the conception of Him must necessarily vary according to the past evolution and the present nature. So, depending on our own makeup, our own conditioning, our own sanskars from this life and past life, the door of entry to what really Guru represents to us could mean different to different person. To an atheist, he may represent it in form of an ideal self. To a pantheist, it may be the universal force. To a bhakt, it may be a Lord's name in any of the form. So the door of entry may vary, but actually the inner guide or guru is all this and much more than this. And when this process of opening up of the lotus of Shastra is happening within us. And this personal effort within us is gradually becoming effortless. And our whole being is gradually becoming tethered to the feet of that eternal Guru within. The fourth aid is required, that is the Kala or the time. And here Sri Aurobindo talks about the two key aspects of the attitude one has to take towards time. One being of an endless patience. One needs to be ready to wait endlessly, infinitely for this to happen, for the journey to continue. But at the same time, to have a very strong energy, a strong, instantaneous, transformative energy within oneself. So it is a combination of endless patience and strong, intense internal energy which takes us towards the supreme divine transformation. So these are the four aids, and just to summarize the key insights and the actionables from our conversation today, it is important for all of us to understand that the Veda is located within, and one has to find out one's own unique path. It is not about being influenced by other people's choices. We have to find it within. And a key actionable in doing that, one of the simplest way is to start journaling or writing what is there within us. The second is to sit with oneself and look at what are those top 5 things, or what are most important things which are pulling us outwards, and to loosen the cords of those things and then seek intensity inwards. If anything, pray for more and more intensity, seek for more and more strength to gather that intensity at every level, whether it's our mind, our heart, or our willpower. And then thirdly, to be vigilant on the way of all the things which are again still active within us, all the attachments and desires. So I'll end with some beautiful lines from Adi Shankaracharya ji. Shariram surupam tathava kalatram yashascharu chitram dhanam merutulyam Gururagni padame manaschena lagnam tatah kim tatah kim tatah kim tatah kim Shariram surupam. One may have the most beautiful body, tathava kalatram, and the most beautiful spouse, yashascharu chitram, and one may be blessed with fame and name all across the world, dhanam merutulyam, and boundless money. Gururagri padame manaschena lagnam. But if the mind is not centered at the lotus feet of the divine or the Guru, tatah kim, tatah kim, tatah kim, tatah kim. What is the use? What is the use? What is the use? Shadangadi Vedo Mukhe Shastra Vidya. One may be the knower of all the Vedas, all the Upanishads, and may have all the Vidya and wisdom on one's tip of tongue. Kavitva-digadyam supadyam karoti. And one utters the most beautiful poetry out of their mouth. Gururagni padme manaschena lagnam tatah kim tatah kim tatah kim tatah kim. Thank you. So I call upon Dr. Bijlani to just enrich the conversation further.
After that beautiful ending with that sonorous verse, it will be quite redundant to say anything. But since Mankul has been generous in asking me to make a few comments, the best I can do is to once again recapitulate, which also he has done, what has been spoken. And this becomes valuable because on the path of integral yoga, there is no rigid prescribed path. And therefore, any hints that we get, any guidelines that we get about what we can actually do becomes very precious. And these 4 aids are amongst those very precious guidelines which we have available from the Master in guiding us on what we can actually do on our part as our sadhana on the path of integral yoga. And the 2 aids that have been discussed today are the Shastra and the Utsaaha. Now, Shastra is a written sort of, generally taken as a written scripture, which will tell us what is right and wrong, or which will tell us what we should be doing to progress spiritually, to address the purpose of life. And although in the Sanatana Dharma tradition, on which is based the philosophy of Vedanta, which in turn is the basic foundation of yoga, in this tradition, there is no dearth of scriptures, and in fact, there is also no ban on creating more scriptures. And yet, the highest scripture is within us, and that is what Sri Aurobindo has emphasized in this. We may use the scriptures which are available, but we don't have to be restricted by them, we don't have to be restrained by them, because the highest scripture is actually within us. And here the word that he has used, that the eternal Veda is within us, should not be confused with the Vedas. We have to read the whole sentence and pay full attention to what has been said, because the word Veda here has not been used as a substitute for the 4 Vedas which we know as amongst the oldest scriptures, not only in our tradition, but amongst the oldest scriptures in the world. Here the reference is to Veda as a word. And as a word, Veda just means knowledge. So the highest knowledge is within us. That's what this word Veda here in this context means. The second aid is Utsaaha. And it's interesting that Sri Aurobindo has used the word Utsaaha, which means enthusiasm, not the word Prayatna, which means effort. Because this effort has to be enthusiastic. And how can that enthusiasm come? It can come primarily from what Mankul referred to as the intrinsic motivation. And here I'll turn to an analogy that he gave about the itch and the scratch. In case of skin diseases, if the person has an itch and scratches, he enjoys the scratching but makes the skin disease actually worse. And therefore, this pleasure that he gets from the scratching becomes counterproductive. It tempts him. He tends to scratch again and again because it's very tempting, but he keeps spoiling his skin lesion, and that is why he's told right in the beginning, resist this right from the beginning. Now, how does it relate to the intrinsic motivation here? And while reflecting, listening to Mankul, what I felt was that here, it in fact can work both ways. Just because we are on the path of yoga, we don't cease to be ordinary human beings and are subject to still the same type of vital pulls which may pull our consciousness down, be it the pleasures of the palate or be it the pleasures of sex. They tend to pull us down. We don't cease to be complete, or for that matter, other types of pleasures, ordinary pleasures of life, be it in various types of sensory satisfaction or even intellectual satisfaction from our work. All these, in a broad sense, are things which, if we take to satisfy our ever dissatisfied ego, they tend to pull us down. And therefore, to enjoy that itch for these pleasures and respond to it by giving into them, which will correspond to the scratch, it can build up that vicious cycle in the same way and keep pulling us down instead of progressing, and therefore this can be harmful on the path of yoga. But then here it can turn the other way around also. Realizing the limitations of these pleasures and these pulls is one of the circumstances which leads to another type of itch, the itch for the divine, which we call aspiration. That is also an itch. Now here, if you give in to this itch and scratch, you start enjoying it. And when you start enjoying it, you feel like scratching more. And that's what makes the itch go up. And therefore here it can work also in a positive way, the itch-scratch cycle. And there's no harm if we give in to it and give in to that type of an itch. So it all depends upon what type of itch we are talking about. And that is what makes us should make us decide whether we decide to scratch or resist that itch, itch to scratch. Because that also, scratching itself is an itch, isn't it? So we resist that. So that is what passed through my mind while listening to Mankul. And this, how can this journey be enjoyable? That is another thing. It's a long journey. Then how it can be enjoyable so that this itch is worth retaining and the scratch doesn't do us any harm. It happens because there is a joy not only in reaching the goal, there is a joy also in effort and pursuit. And that is what, it is the joy of effort and the joy of pursuit that creates that intrinsic motivation, and that's what leads to Utsaaha rather than simple prayatna. So with this, I think I should stop here because that is what austerity of speech is about. I'll end with a beautiful couplet which I heard in this context, why one should not speak too much. इधर उधर की बातों में क्या रखा है, इधर उधर की बातों में क्या रखा है, कहो तो कुछ ऐसा कहो जो खामोशी से अच्छा हो.